Welcome to the Off Central podcast. My name is Jonathan. So glad you decided to join us here today for the next hour or so. And today, of course, we have returning our very own family guest member. I'm going with it.
Let's do it.
Mr. Shane Willard is in the house. My sagacious friend is here and ready to go.
What a great word.
Great word. It's my new favorite word, sagacious.
Sagacious. What's it mean?
It means sharp of thought.
Oh,
and I think economy of language as well. Just very witty,
good.
sharp, sagacious.
Yeah. Sagacious. I'll take it.
I only use it for the very smartest of our guests.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
At the Off Central podcast, we spare no expense. Well, today we're talking about a topic which I think is probably one of the most talked about topics, not just in the Christian world, but in the world. The book came out a couple of years ago called Atomic Habits.
Oh, yeah.
And so habits has become one of these hot topic words. In my world, habits I've always said is a bit like a comfortable bed, easy to get into, hard to get out of. Yep. And particularly bad habits, and convincing ourselves that freedom is better than comfort is very, very difficult for us. And so I know you've got some thoughts around this, and I would maybe just dive straight in, because all of us, all the time, we always just end up in these cycles of destructive habits, destructive behavior, patterns of life. Yep. And for so many of us, we just can't get out of it.
Yeah. Let's talk about first how they form.
Okay.
Right. So, and there's not one answer to this. I'm just giving one answer. Okay. And that is, let's look specifically at how, I think one of the worst questions people could ask is, am I normal? Well, I get what you mean by that, but normal is simply a function of how you were raised up to the age of 8. That's what you think normal is.
Yeah.
How do you handle conflict? Well, that's formed in someone by the age of 8. How do we respond in this and that, and what we think. That's why when you're a teenager and you went to your first sleepover at a friend's house, you probably thought they were weird, right? If they're not acting exactly how your family did, well, they're weird, right?
By the age of 8.
Yeah, that personality is formed.
Wow.
And so and then it either gets reinforced or not, and then you can adjust along the way. But it's not like a hope, because the question that has to ask, that we have to ask is not, am I normal? It's, is what I think normal is, does it belong to life or death, light or dark, however, whatever metaphor you want to use. And is what I think normal is, am I doomed to that? And think about the language that we use around that. Well, that's just who I am. We never use that about healthy things.
Right.
Like, I'm just nice. It's just who I am. Take me or leave me. I'm just generous. I'm just funny.
Right.
We just use who I am.
Yeah, we use it as an excuse for our destructive, dysfunctional behaviors.
It's like, you look, when I get disappointed, I have an anger problem. It's just who I am. Right. It's like, okay, take me or leave me. Right. Yeah. Most people will leave you. Yeah. Right. Eventually. Right.
And for good reason.
Right. So the question is what I think normal is it life or death? That's a good question to ask. And the principle is does my learned normal behavior from my family of origin, does it impact my adult life? The answer is yes, to varying degrees, and some people more intense than others. Like, if you grew up in a home and your mother tried to stab you when you were 5, well, that is definitely going to, in some ridiculous way, likely could form a personality disorder. It impacts your adult life.
Sure.
All right. And the second question is if that's the case, am I doomed to perpetuate that into perpetuity, or can I be empowered to change that?
Okay.
Right. And so those are the things at play. And the people who live the most empowered are the ones who resist the urge to blame their family of origin for why they are the way they are, and instead draw a line in the sand and take responsibility and say, I will move forward, right? And so there's all kinds of scriptural thoughts around this. So you take Paul in Ephesians 6, he said something like, we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers. So he actually framed it as, whatever's hurting your life here, don't get mad at the person. You're actually fighting something. There's an atmosphere underneath that, right? The writer of Proverbs thought that the thing we were fighting was actually our internal thoughts, like as a person thinks deep inside themselves. So as our normal is getting developed, so that those deep internal thoughts are what needs to change. So Paul was like, "Oh, you're fighting something that's not a person." The writer of Proverbs is like, "Yeah, that's true. You're fighting that space between your head and your emotions. You're fighting that." Then in Exodus, and I this is not a podcast on the hermeneutical implications of how far Moses meant this, or what intensity he meant it. But if we just take it for what he said in Exodus 34, the sins of the father get passed down, right? Mm-hmm. And there's some people who take it as an unbreakable curse sort of thing. And then there's some people that just pointed out as a principle that, when you act outside of life, it impacts the next generation.
Right. If your father was an alcoholic and that's all you've ever known, it's not guaranteed, but there's a highly likelihood you will develop a different relationship to alcohol than you would have in another environment.
Correct. And then Jesus, I think it's important to point out Jesus' invitation. He says, "Come to me, all you are weary and heavy burdened, and I'll give you rest." So the invitation of Jesus around these things in our life is to surrender them to him, not for condemnation or shaming, but for rest, to find rest in it. So in Exodus 34, it's like the sins passed down. But then Ezekiel 18, he says, actually, it disempowers you to use that scripture as a crutch to just go, well, in our language, the Bible says, I get the sins of my dad. There's not really much I could do about it. Yep. Ezekiel brings another side to it that just says, I don't want to ever hear it out of your mouth again that my father ate sour grapes, and that's why my teeth are set on edge. That doesn't empower you at all. And Ezekiel gives this pretty revolutionary concept that would not have passed the sniff test of the internet heresy hunter trolley people, right? He's like, I know Exodus 34 says this, but the way you're applying it, it's like, no. Every generation, and he tells this story, and he just pokes a big giant, he points out that you could drive a Big Mac truck through applying it a certain way. He says, suppose a guy is righteous and his son is wicked, and then the grandson is righteous. Who inherits what from who? Does this guy get the righteousness of his dad, or does the dad have to pay the price for the wickedness of the son? And what about the grandson who's acting like the granddad, but his dad was pretty bad? And he just points out that actually the most empowering thing is every generation stands on their own 2 feet and makes a choice. And so I would say the first thing we have to say is that what you think is normal is not your fault. However, the most empowering posture you can take in life is to resist blaming why you are the way you are, and to take responsibility moving forward by asking a question: is what I think normal is it life or death? Is how I normally handle conflict, is it bringing life or death? Yes. How I spend my money, is it life or death? How I invest my money, is it life or death? How I treat the poor, is it life or death? My basic attitude towards people with less resources, is that life or death? And so these things get formed in lots of different ways. And the good news is that the way we act now affects the next generation. We can't get away with that. In other words, what we learned in childhood shows back up in adulthood. No question about that. But that two things can be true at the same time. Just because it shows back up in adulthood doesn't mean we're disempowered to be our family tree hero. Like when our parents allowed us to act in ways that made them dislike us. I love the way Jordan Peterson says it in his 12 Rules for Life. He says, never let your children act in a way that makes you dislike them. Because you're wired to love them. If you allow them to act in a way that makes you dislike them, the world's going to hate them.
Right.
So when our parents did that, it shows back up. It just shows back up. And we learned all kinds of things from our family of origin. Like we learned coping mechanisms. How do you cope? Do you isolate? Do you get angry? Do you engage in addictive behavior? Do you engage in a misuse of substances? That's a coping mechanism. Sometimes we learned you cope by throwing a tantrum. I tried slamming a door once. My dad removed the door.
Yeah.
I
hit one of my sisters once. My dad had me up against the wall.
Correct.
Do not hit women. You want to hit someone, hit me.
Yeah. Well, could you imagine if he let that go?
Right.
I handle conflict by violence.
Right.
We're just going to let that go.
Right.
Right. No, he ended it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And that was good.
Yes.
Right. You're not a female abuser.
No, yeah, exactly.
But there are people who they didn't. What if we learn to cope by withholding affection, like creating affection deficits? I'm in conflict, so I'm not going to hug you. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to talk to you. So we sometimes learn that. Sometimes we learn scorekeeping is a coping mechanism, right?
Which is probably the most common I find in relationships. Everyone does it.
It's like, and think about our language. I don't want to do this, man. It'll give me points with the wife. It's like,
yes, yeah.
Points with the wife. She make you collect points?
And that's the motivation of your heart.
What are they good for?
Right.
When you cash the points in, what do you get?
What do you redeem them for?
And are you playing a game where you get 1 point for every good thing and then you lose 10,000 points every time? You're like, and it just, when we reduce the opportunity to be in a loving thing to the altar of scorekeeping, it's not good. Imagine if I'm keeping a running tally in my head. I want to be clear, I'm not doing this. But imagine if I was keeping a running tally in my head for what I've done for you in your life. And then I either monetize that or emotionalize that into what you owe me.
Right. It just becomes a new currency.
And then now you paid for my golf the other day. Okay, so I think I'm still ahead though. It just becomes a new. So we learn coping. Here's a few things we learned from our family of origin. We learn coping mechanisms. We learn financial expectations, right? What does a winning life look like, right? And so people who grew up with meager means have certain expectations. They're happier with certain things. People who grew up in the middle have certain expectations. People who grew up with opulence, they end up expecting and so is it right or wrong? Neither. It's just they're normal. But we learn our financial expectations. We learn our coping mechanisms from our family of origin. We learn relational dynamics, like were the Protheros feelers? Were the Protheros thinkers? Were the Protheros distant? Were the Willards feelers, thinkers? Were they distant? It's not right or wrong. It's just we learn it. Mm-hmm. We inherit our DNA. And that now they're learning how much that actually impacts certain ways that we perceive our world. We definitely learned our communication skills from where else are we going to learn it? From our family of origin and our school. That's it. What did we do to successfully get attention? Kids aren't thinking this intentionally, but if they engage in something and they get attention, and you see parents rewarding bad behavior. Could you imagine, Shannon Sharp was talking about this on the sports thing the other day, this linebacker refused to go in the game. And Shannon Sharp was like, I just think that's bad parent. Like my mom, if I threw a tantrum, there was no way I was getting the ice cream.
Right.
But when you're appeased in something bad, we learn that
this is what I have to do in order to get what I want.
That behavior gets attention. And so whatever successfully got us attention in childhood becomes our standard for attention getting in adulthood. We get our spiritual heritage from our family of origin, right? Like you are a Christian in some part because it's how you raised.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It's that.
Yeah.
And then this is probably too much pressure, and I don't mean to put pressure on the moms more than the dads. They both matter, but the mirrors, our basic sense of self often comes from the internal voice of our mother. So if I said, go back to your childhood and tell me the voice of your mom, that largely determines our sense of self-esteem and that sort of thing. And so if your mom was like, you could do it, you're smart, hey, I love you, like those, and no one's perfect, but if those are the primary voices, versus you ruined my life, these are other, if I wouldn't have had you, I would have, right? These sorts of things. And so you have this sort of thing. And this is why it's important. in every January, people do this without thinking about it. They wrestle with this question. Here's the question underneath the question, and that is, how powerful is my tradition? Am I doomed to just repeat that tradition for another year? Or can I be empowered to change my life for something better? I'm using the word tradition not in the positive sense, like there's some traditions that are, I'm using it in the sense of how things have always been.
Yeah.
Are they necessarily how they will always be? And what do I do when I take an audit of my communication skills, my coping mechanisms, my financial expectations, the way that I see myself? When I take an audit of that, there's parts of that needs to go on, and there's parts of those traditions that need to end. Mm-hmm. And how do I do that? Like, what do I do to make that? And in January, everybody's wrestling with this. Like, mm-hmm. I've always been fat. I'm not going to be fat anymore. I'm going to go to the gym. That's why all gyms are full till January 14th.
Yeah. You know? So your tradition has been overeating for 20 years, and the question in the new year is, will my tradition win out?
Yep.
Or can I have a new pattern, lifestyle, whatever it is? Can something change?
Right. And so my dad's a gym junkie. My dad has worked out every day. He's 78.
Oh, good for him.
He can still... Like, I went and saw him the other day. He had blood in his eye, you know, and I didn't know if he knew it. I couldn't stop looking at it, you know? And I was like, Dad,
are you all right?
I don't know if you know this, your eyes bleed. You have blood in your eye hole, you know? Dad's like, I know. I was like, are you doing something about this?
Is there a story here?
He said, yeah. He said, my workout partner challenged me to bench press 285 pounds.
Oh, my gosh.
4 times, you know? And this is dead weights, like barbells on, you know. This ain't cables.
Right.
That's still impressive then. Put 285 on a Nautilus machine.
I couldn't do that with a leg press.
No. It's like, what? My whole body just disintegrates into. So Dad, he said, I got 3 of them up, you know, and the 4th one, and his eye exploded. You know?
My word.
You know, so, but Dad will tell you, you know, he hates January at the gym.
Right. Because everyone comes.
Yeah, February to December, he's got his space and can do his routine, you know, not in January. So, but those stories, and people will do it primarily with fitness, nutrition, mm-hmm. finance. Okay. And I would urge people to go further and do something deeper than that, like coping mechanisms. Like, what could we do different? I cope this way. What if I made a 30-day commitment, or 60, to see if I could create another habit to cope a different way? And so there's a story in Scripture that I just find incredibly moving and brave. You asked me the other day what my favorite book of the Bible is. I said Ruth.
You did.
Because the reason is outside of like the Sermon on the Mount and the Jesus stories. Ruth is that book in the Bible where the whole Bible shifts. You start to see an arc, right? Up until that point, you got kind of like here's the rules, here's where we came from, here's the rules, here's how we're going to be human. And then Ruth is this revolutionary story where they chose to be loving instead of biblical. Deuteronomy 23 says,
what a line.
Deuteronomy 23 says, no Moabites ever.
Yeah.
Now you got a Moabite wanting to be a Jew, and they have a choice: be biblical or be Christ-like. And they have no revelation of Christ. So they choose to treat her as they would want to be treated. They fulfill Scripture instead of being right about it. And because of that, Jesus comes, Ruth's the 18-time great-grandmother of Jesus.
Right.
So I think Ruth is this incredible short story about how you won't regret it if you err on the side of loving, despite there's clear rule that no Moabites are allowed. And it shows that in the Bible itself, they made space for that. Right. But there's this other story. It's in 2 Kings. It's about an 8-year-old named Josiah. And Josiah takes over. And think about how bad the world would be back then. Like God's not done redeeming the world by any means, but it's certainly better. Mm-hmm. If our national leader died, there's a clear order of, succession.
Succession and due process. And
by qualified people.
Yeah.
Back then, Your son's 8. It's him.
Yeah.
And this created disasters in France. Historically, and that shouldn't surprise us. Mm-hmm. A 14-year-old takes over the throne and has infinite power.
yeah. This is Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly.
This is, yeah.
And so Josiah's 8, and he takes over. And from 8 to 20-ish, he just kind of plays along. His advisors are there. But the story goes that his grandfather was a guy named Manasseh. And Manasseh invited all the gods from the surrounding tribes to be a part of the temple, Jerusalem, right? He erected a god named Molech in Gehenna to protect the southwest side. Now, there's 2 ways to look at it. One is the malicious way, which is he just was wicked and didn't care and sacrificed children and horrendous things. Or he was afraid and he was hedging his bets. The way to keep all the tribes from attacking you is just to allow images of their gods on your property, and
problem solved.
They're going to leave you alone.
Yeah.
But either way, it produced something terrible, because it produced a syncretism where kind of anything goes. It's a great story from a couple different standpoints on the role of fear, or the impact of maliciousness. You could go that way with it, or you could go the way that says what feels like liberty actually created horrendous stuff. Like if you just tell everybody anything goes, assuming everybody's good-hearted, that sounds like it, but it never works. Like if human beings aren't wired to not have any guardrails or boundaries or something that defines what moral life is, and so it was just a free-for-all, and it ended up, I don't know, it doesn't say whether Manasseh intended it. It just says he did it, and this was the result. Mm-hmm. Children started being sacrificed to Molech. There was, orgies in the temple. Like it was bad. Yeah. And then his son was a guy named Ammon, and Ammon took over and chose not to change the tradition. It was just going to be too hard. Okay. And so he did the things Manasseh did. He just kept it going. Sure. Right? And then Josiah is Ammon's son, and Josiah takes over at 8. And one of his first moves is he ends child sacrifice. Like, presumably because he's like, it's like his second grade mates are like, come on, bro, throw us a bone. Like, he's 8, they're setting us on the fiery hands of Molech. It's just not good, sure. But Josiah, somebody, and he's a kid, and by the time he starts enacting these strategies, he's a young adult. But what the catalyst for it was, he looked at, I'm paraphrasing this, he looked at how people were living and going, the way my grandfather and father envisioned this going, if they had a good vision of it, it didn't work. Uh-huh. If they were trying to ruin things, they won. Sure. This is really not good. And somebody said, well, should we get Leviticus back out? And let's do that. Mm-hmm. And so the way I read it, presumably it was like the first time in his life because they had went away from that. Gotcha. Yeah. And he's hearing things like, love your neighbor as yourself, and don't set God up in ways that only you can understand him, and right, sure. Don't have images. And he's looking around and he's going, no wonder this is a disaster. It's actually going against what made us good, mm-hmm. right? And so he does the very difficult thing, and he changes the tradition. He tears everything down. Mm. Think about that, bro. Like think about, he's kind of a kid, and there are people who knew his dad, and maybe people who knew his granddad, who were in positions of power. He had more power just because of title. But imagine the whispers in his ear, like, bro, your granddad built that with his bare hands. Right. You know what it cost him to erect that Asherah pole? Do you know what that much iron cost to put Molech up? Do you know, your grandfather would be turning over in his grave if he saw what you were doing here. You're ruining everything he did. And I think Josiah is a great case study allegorically of what it takes to break the tradition, to how things have been isn't necessarily how it will always be. Break the cycle. There's, our parents will always hand us a proclivity towards certain things, but it's not a predetermination. No, that's right.
If that's how I'm understanding
That's
kind
right.
of what you're getting at here. There'll always be a bent because we're handed down things like you said, but it doesn't determine or predetermine the rest of your life unless you allow it to.
That's right.
And I find, and you will find this with many people in talking about them, about their habits or destructive behaviors, how much control they've handed over. Like you talk about this idea of empowerment and freedom in finding empowerment when you finally make the decision to sort of forge your own path, if you will. But many people, they're just letting life happen to them. Well, my father ate sour grapes. My dad did this, and so it's me. And it's just life is happening to them, and they have no efficacy or autonomy over kind of what's, there's no centralized nervous system going, you can create a different path here.
Right.
All the power's been handed over to other people or heritage or whatever.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, I also know people who want to create something different, and then there are other voices. Yeah, but have you seen what your father built up? You're undoing all of that.
Yeah.
So there's a manipulation sort of element to all of this as well.
Yeah, like there's all that pressure. And so Josiah does this, and I would say a couple of things. If you kind of got lost any of that, and you need linear thought, one, the most empowering thing you could do is not ask, am I normal? Is what I think normal. Does it belong to life or death? Two, can I be empowered or am I blaming?
Right.
That's number two. And number three, there's more at stake with this than meets the eye. And that's the lie that can lead us into apathy is, it's just between me and God. Normally not. Maybe sometimes, but in general, not. If it's just between you and God, do whatever you want. He can handle you. But it almost always is you and God and your daughter and your son and your neighbor and your coworkers and your, and then generationally.
How that gets perpetuated and expanded.
Yeah, there's more at stake than we see. Think about Josiah. Josiah's actions kept a large portion of Israel from going back into exile.
Yes, yeah.
So there was more at stake than met the eye.
Yeah.
Like my great-grandfather was a illiterate moonshiner. I'm not mad at him. No one taught him to read. He made his living moonshining. He was in the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so my great grandfather was an illiterate moonshining racist. So how do you get from a literate moonshining racist to a guy with 3 university degrees traveling the world talking about the compassion of Christ for all people? Well, at some point, someone had to break that tradition. Like somebody had to go, the way things have always been, and for me, it was my parents, my mom and dad were like, look, our children are going to go to school, our children are going to read, they're going to read books, our children are going to learn the ways of Jesus, our children are not going to be racist, that won't be allowed in our house because that's just dumb. And, in one generation, they changed the tradition.
Yes, yeah.
And that would be a lot of people's story. And the hope in that is there's a challenge and then there's a hope. The challenge is if you don't, you're leaving it to your children to do. What are you doing? The hope is that you can be the hero for your family tree.
Right.
You can.
Right.
And whereas, like, I'm talking, this would have happened this year. Somebody said, man, you must come from do you come from a long line of educated preachers? I'm thinking, no,
Sure.
So what better way to honor them than to live a certain way now? And so there's those 4 thoughts. But when you look at the Josiah narrative, I mean, he changed everything. There was more at stake than meets the eye. There was national implications in terms of exile. There was political implications. He restored the title king to something of honor, right? There was implications to his own family, right? There was implications, all these things. But how did he do it? So you go back and read the whole story. What he did is he focused on positive role models instead of what he hated.
Okay.
Like the truth of it is you are what you hate.
Uh-huh. Oh,
right?
wow. Okay.
Right? If you think about something long enough and build a disciplined imagination around that, and you think about it till you feel it, even if it's bad, you're going to create that atmosphere around your life.
Right.
This is why you never can overcome a destructive habit by fighting it. You overcome a destructive habit by replacing it with something better, right? Something that you convince your mind that has more pleasure attached to it. So if I said, all right, we're gonna defeat anger by trying not to be angry. Well, by definition, you're just going to be thinking about anger. Like, to use a dumb kind of hyperbolic example, like I'll give you $10,000 not to think of a pink purple elephant, and you're like, I'm trying not to. So by trying not to, you end up empowering it in your mind. So what happens is, this is why you see this all the time. I'm not going to be like my dad, right? And then they are, right? Because they're trying so hard not to be, that they end up thinking about it so much that it just empowers that.
Right. So the easiest way, so to not think about a pink elephant, you don't try and not think of it. What you try and do is think of a blue lion.
Right.
And you picture something, you have to replace it with a whole nother
You have to replace it with a whole nother image.
Yeah.
And so you never beat something by fighting it. You beat something by replacing it. And so when you think about that relationally and habitually, I mean, are we, here's a good question, are we surrounding ourselves with people that remind us of what we hate, or who empower us and push us to be our best?
Yeah. Which is why our environments are so important.
Well, Psalm 1.
Right. Yes.
Don't walk in the counsel of the wicked, or sit in it.
Right. And you've heard the phrase many times that you'll end up becoming, the average of your 5 best friends, or the people you hang out with the most. You're going to be sort of some kind of conglomerate of them.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So your environments really determine who you are.
And we can ask some good questions around that. The people in your inner circle, can you be honest with them? Maybe a better question, can they be honest with you? Could they tell you something they see without you
exploding?
Like, are you teachable? And I think the question Josiah's story asks is, how far are we willing to go? This guy tore down monuments. Think about the political implications of that. Just the monetary cost, 1. 2, the tradition cost. 3, the potential political implication that you're telling the tribe that lives 2 doors down, we're removing your God from our thing. Right.
You're undoing their, think of all the priests, everybody who works there. You're just taking away their
treaties.
Money.
Yeah.
Taking away their economic sort of structure. It all disappears.
And there would have been questions like, is it really worth it? Like, we don't really acknowledge those gods anyway, but it keeps them from invading us. There would have been that.
Right.
Like how far was this guy willing to go? And I think we could look at the story and ask that, but then the story makes us ask, am I willing to go far enough do I really want to change my life? Or am I actually, it's not that I'm happy, but the tradition isn't hurting me enough to motivate me to move.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a great question. He formed relationships with people who were he actually kicked out the advisors that were syncretic, and he formed relationships with people who were going where he wanted. And I think that's a critical thing in terms of, okay, here's one way to look at it. When you go to bed at night, what's the loudest voice? Right? So the loudest voice in your head when you're trying to fall asleep, if the loudest voice in your head is someone who believes in you and is supporting you and rooting you on, awesome. If the loudest voice, what if the loudest voice in your head is the person you can't forgive? Well, now that just firmly entrench you into that tradition of not forgiving, right? And so you have, and so I think a question we have to ask is who are we listening to? Who are we listening to? So Josiah went to big lengths. He changed his environment. Number 3, do not allow things in your environment that remind you of what you hate. He wouldn't allow anything back in that says, no, that goes, I see where this goes. This goes here. We're not doing that again.
Right.
We're not. And I think if we took any habit that is hurting us, some people can have 1 drink. Some people have to have 20, and you know the difference. Like when people act like alcohol's out. That's not true. Imagine someone who just learned from the age of 8 to cope with substance. Well, that's a fundamentally different struggle for that person than somebody who copes with taking a 5-mile walk, right? And those are fundamentally, different things. And so Josiah burned millions of dollars worth of artifacts because it wasn't life. He exiled people that wouldn't get on board. He lost people he cared about. But he asked a question that was really important. Instead of, you've always been at the table, so therefore you will always be, he re-asked the question, who actually belongs at the table? And think about that. Just think about it from business, right? So Campbell Soup, a big soup company in America.
Yeah, yeah.
They were going broke. This was years ago. And so they put the smartest minds, what are we going, maybe our soup needs to be better quality. So they made better quality soup. Still. Then they made another thing. And then it wasn't working. And then at some point, one of the guys they brought in just asked the right question and said, why are we still serving it in a can? See, Campbell Soup, you had to open it and heat it up in a pot.
Yes.
But microwaves had been invented. And so they started packaging it in microwavable safe bowls. And it was just the right person asking the right question at the right moment, at the right time. And so I would ask two questions about that. One, and then I would encourage one, are the people at your table allowed to ask the right questions? And two, you never know when the right person is going to ask the right question that changes everything for a very, very long time. And if there's not space for that, we can get stuck. We can get stuck in just our tradition,
right?
In the way things. Campbell Soup was always in a can. Why why not? I think another thing he did is he decided a standard that would be the line.
Okay.
Right. He said, okay, just moral relativism isn't working. It sounds good, but when people just have no boundaries on what it means to be a human, it's bad for humanity.
Okay.
And he just drew a line. And he said, "This is where we're going to be," and I think if we put all of that together into a 7-pronged strategy to change your life or something, it would be ask is what I think. Do a could audit is what I think normal is. Does it belong to life or death? Am I doomed to perpetuate that, or can I be empowered? Am I blaming, or can I take responsibility and move forward?
Yeah.
How far am I willing to take a journal and write down whether it was your coping mechanisms, your communication style, your financial expectations, whatever it is, write down what you learned from your family of origin, and then admit this is what I think normal is, and then empower yourself to go to extremes to change it. Hey, just because your granddad did it doesn't mean just because Manasseh and Ammon. No, it's that who belongs at my table. What is the question I'm not asking that could change my life? Who's in my life? Who could ask that question?
Yes. Yeah.
Could I go sit down with someone and say, you're free to ask any question you want, that because I know that your heart is for my best, and I'm open to changing my life, and just see what happens. And in January, February, you might find that your tradition is going to win out. And then that'll put it off to the next year, and hopefully not the next generation. Or you can be empowered and change your life. And never underestimate the power of a 2-degree shift. Jesus called it a mustard seed.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, this principle is like, we're both golfers. We went out and played the other day. And Shane whooped me.
That day was a different day.
You had a good day, but like with a driver, the further you hit the ball, so the longer the goal, 1 or 2 degrees makes a bigger and bigger impact.
Huge.
So if you're only hitting at 100 yards, 1 or 2 degrees, it has some difference. It'll make some impact. But if you're hitting at 300 yards and you're 2 degrees off, that ball's going to end up way off target.
You're in the woods.
And I think that's just the longer game you're playing with your goals or your dreams or inheritance or whatever it is you want to sow for the future, the longer term that is, 1 or 2 degrees can all of a sudden make a dramatic impact further down the line.
And the hope in that is, the hope in that on the positive side is that don't be disappointed with the 2-degree mustard seed shift, because if you stick to it, Jesus said it this way: if it gets in your ground, it might even be so inconsequential you don't even notice it, but before you know it takes over your whole field.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And then on the negative side is when we engage in death, all it takes is a little bit of that too, and before we know it, it's created a habit that's impacted our 4 children. And so I would just really urge people listening to this to realize there's more at stake than meets the eye.
Yes. Yeah.
Your faith can be in play. Your future can be in play. The future of the people you love can be in play. And so to just be apathetic about it is not is not the way to go.
Yeah, irresponsible. Yeah, this is the principle of reaping and sowing, and often we talk about, I think people often get caught up in what they've reaped for their life without forgetting that everything you do, you're sowing, whether you know it or not. You are in the process of sowing for the future, either for good or for bad. And people go to great lengths to understand what they've reaped from their inheritance without maybe paying too much attention to what am I tilling right now and what am I sowing for the future.
And what impact does this have? And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about discipline, judgment, punishment, Ananias, Sapphira. And I think it's important to realize that in those ancient communities, they took this so seriously, what we're talking about now. Like your actions, and remember they're in an agrarian society where it was a bit superstitious, but if your actions was going to cause God to withhold rain, it's not just you, bro.
Right, it's everyone.
We're all starving because of you, right? And that created some real problems, like, who sinned that this guy, and this trans, and so early on they had transactional ideas, which were wrong. The book of Job was the first in-your-face confrontation to transactional theology, and it takes a long time for good ideas to catch on. By the time Jesus comes along, even his disciples are like, who sinned that? That guy's blind. Jesus is like, what?
We're still there.
Wait, seriously? But they took it so seriously. Like if you were a glutton or a drunkard, so in other words, you eating so much other people can't, you're drinking so much that it's disrupting the peace, or you were a liar about what you gave. Think Ananias and Sapphira. The Dead Sea Scrolls talks about these rituals. They would take you to the edge of town and they would stone you, but not in the literal death, killing someone.
Sure.
They would hold stones and point.
Right.
And it was like a banishment, and they called it death. Like think of it metaphorically as death to us.
Yes.
In other words, you're
dead to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the mission. I think it is talks about how if someone has been put to death or banished, if they come back and the Father discerns that they're sincere, he could welcome them back by cooking them a meal. So think about the prodigal son. And
I've heard that before, that the father ran out to greet the son before any of the servants.
Before the stoning.
Before the stoners could be there and cast him away again.
Correct.
And that's the father's love that chases you down before you get.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so I say those stories to say, in the most encouraging way possible, this is serious. And take your responsibility to your family habits seriously, because you won't regret it. When you instill life and light instead of death and darkness, it matters for generations.
And it really, I think of my own family, my great-grandfather, who was a great man in his own rights. He was the captain of the Carpathia. Rescued all the Titanic survivors in the water. Amazing. And he's got gifts from
that actually sounds like a Disney movie.
It's really
Captain of the Carpathia.
It's a very cool title, isn't it?
Very cool.
We've got little trinkets from President Roosevelt, I think, at home, like as thank yous, and it's really cool, like silver cigarette cases. Amazing. He's got some amazing things.
My great-grandfather was the captain of the distillery.
Right. Well,
this is really good.
But that's the thing. He was also a drunk. He was known as an amazing public speaker, but gambled all the money away, all the inheritance, all of it.
Oh, right.
And my grandfather also drank and smoked his entire life, and not a mean or cruel, malicious man. He just did what his dad did. At 18, he got kicked out because he was an adult. And so what did he do to my dad? You're 18, out you go, and drank and smoked. And I loved my grandfather. At the end of his life, he became one of the sweetest. I have the best. He's like Richard Rohr. I picture him. He still has that white beard, and he's Santa. Anyway, but my dad changed at some point in his life. He said, "I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to do this." And so for years in his life, he didn't participate, and now he can handle it. And so when I grew up, drink was never an issue. I never in my life had to go, I'm not going to do this anymore because it's so destructive, even though there'd been a family pattern of it for 3-4 generations.
Yeah.
And why did that happen? Because my dad made a change. He made a 2-degree shift. to go, I'm not going to participate in this behavior, and it affected me, and it'll affect my kids, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And I that's what you're talking about. This thing has real power, not just over your life, but over generations of life. And it's not just in the negative sense. It's not just about stopping bad behaviors, but if you can implement healthy things.
Right.
My dad decided to become a Christian, and that affected, and a pastor, and that affected our lives for a positive.
Yes.
I believe. There was also some challenging things
of
with
course.
that too, but that every parent out there, everybody, you will affect the people around you, for good or for bad, and all of your choices have that power at play. And so it's just a great way to think about the responsibility that we have with our choices.
This season, it's your tradition or an empowerment to change your life, and be empowered. Be empowered. Your tradition does not have to win. The way things have been doesn't necessarily mean it's how it always will be.
Yeah, super powerful. Man, Shane, thank you so much.
Easy. We
love having you here. And thank you again for tuning in, sitting with us as we unpack some things from Scripture. Go ahead and click that like button. That would really help us out. Subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I hope that this has in some way enriched your life. God bless.